Some people move through life with the sense that they are arriving where they are meant to be, while others carry a quieter feeling, one that is harder to name, where time seems to move forward without quite bringing them along with it. This feeling does not always come from failure or loss, and it does not announce itself loudly, because often it exists beneath a life that still appears functional, stable, and intact from the outside. It shows up in small moments, in passing thoughts, in the way the future is imagined, and in the subtle awareness that something feels out of sync, even when nothing is visibly broken. This reflection is not about solutions or advice, and it is not an attempt to explain life in simple terms, but an exploration of what it feels like to live with the sense of being left behind, quietly, gradually, and often without fully understanding when it began. For most people, the feeling of being left behind does not arrive as a shock, nor does it announce itself with clarity or urgency, because it enters life quietly, almost respectfully, slipping into ordinary moments where nothing appears broken and nothing demands immediate attention. Life, from the outside, continues to look acceptable, even stable, which is precisely what makes the feeling so difficult to identify at first, because there is no visible collapse to justify it, and no dramatic event that clearly explains why something feels off beneath the surface. The days still follow a recognizable structure, filled with routines that once provided comfort and still technically function. Yet somewhere within that familiarity, a subtle shift begins to take place, as if the internal sense of timing has drifted slightly out of alignment with the world around it. At first, this misalignment is easy to ignore because it disguises itself as patience, reflection, or temporary uncertainty, and it is often interpreted as a natural pause rather than a deeper sense of disconnection. People tell themselves that progress does not need to be rushed, that everyone moves at their own pace, that clarity takes time, and that waiting does not necessarily mean falling behind. And for a while, those explanations feel reasonable enough to quiet the discomfort. But the feeling does not fade simply because it is rationalized. It continues to grow quietly, fed by small, almost forgettable moments that do not seem important when they happen, yet slowly accumulate into something heavier, something harder to dismiss once enough of them begin to gather. It might appear during conversations that feel casual on the surface, when others speak about changes in their lives without hesitation, describing new roles, new commitments, or new directions as if they were natural extensions of who they already are, rather than difficult thresholds they had to cross. The words themselves are not painful, and the tone is rarely boastful. Yet the listener notices a growing distance, not from the people speaking, but from the life they seem to be living with such ease. There is often no envy in these moments, no bitterness, and no desire to take what belongs to someone else, only a quiet awareness that something similar has not happened internally, that the same sense of forward motion has not yet found its way into one's own life. This is where the feeling of being left behind begins to separate itself from ordinary uncertainty. It is no longer just a question of not knowing what comes next, but a deeper sense that time itself is moving forward without waiting, carrying others with it, while one remains standing in place, watching the distance slowly widen. What makes this experience especially unsettling is the absence of a clear explanation. There is no single decision that can be pointed to as a mistake, no obvious failure that justifies the sensation, and no external pressure severe enough to explain why the weight feels so constant. Instead, the feeling exists in the background of everyday life, appearing most clearly during moments of stillness, when distractions fade and comparison no longer requires effort, because it has already taken root internally. Time begins to change its character in subtle ways. Days may still pass quickly, filled with tasks and obligations, yet years begin to feel heavier, more defined, carrying with them a growing awareness of expectations that were never consciously agreed to, but are nevertheless deeply felt. Certain ages begin to feel symbolic, not because they hold intrinsic meaning, but because they are quietly associated with ideas of progress, stability, and direction, creating an unspoken timeline against which life is measured. For someone who feels left behind, these timelines do not necessarily come from explicit pressure imposed by others. More often, they emerge from observation, from noticing how conversations shift, how responsibilities deepen, how the questions people ask begin to change, subtly assuming that certain things should already be in place. And when those assumptions do not align with one's own experience, a quiet tension forms, not loud enough to demand attention, but persistent enough to shape how each day is felt. There is often an accompanying sense of invisibility, not in the sense of being ignored or dismissed, but in the feeling that one's inner struggle is largely unseen because it does not fit into familiar categories of success or failure. From the outside, everything appears fine, which makes it difficult to articulate why something feels so unresolved inside, and even harder to explain it to others without sounding ungrateful or overly sensitive. This is why many people who feel left behind rarely speak about it directly. They learn to carry it privately, treating it as something temporary, something that will eventually resolve itself once the right opportunity appears or the right decision is made. Yet as time continues to pass, the feeling does not necessarily intensify in dramatic ways, but it becomes more familiar, more integrated into the background of daily experience, until it begins to shape how life is perceived, rather than simply interrupting it. Moments that were once neutral begin to carry subtle emotional weight. Milestones that once felt distant start to feel uncomfortably close, not because they are desired, but because they represent movement, direction, and confirmation that life is unfolding, all of which seem increasingly difficult to locate internally. The realization, when it finally becomes clear enough to acknowledge, is rarely sudden. It is not a moment of panic or despair, but a quiet recognition that something has changed in the way time, progress, and self-perception are experienced. It is the understanding that while life has not stopped, it no longer feels synchronized, and that this lack of alignment has begun to shape how the future is imagined, not as something approaching naturally, but as something that feels strangely distant despite being closer than ever. This is often the first true moment of noticing. Not that life has gone wrong, but that it has begun to move in a direction that no longer feels accessible, leaving behind a lingering question that does not yet demand an answer, but quietly insists on being acknowledged. For people who feel left behind, comparison rarely begins as a conscious habit, because it does not start with deliberate measurement or intentional self-judgment, but rather with observation, quiet and unguarded, woven into ordinary moments where attention naturally drifts outward. It happens while listening more than speaking, while noticing patterns in other people's lives without actively searching for them, while absorbing fragments of information that slowly assemble themselves into a larger picture that feels increasingly difficult to ignore. Others appear to be moving, not always quickly, not always confidently, but with a sense of direction that feels tangible, as though they are being carried forward by an internal momentum that requires less effort than it once did. They speak about their lives using language that assumes continuity, referring to what comes next as if it is a natural extension of what already exists, rather than something fragile that could easily fall apart. Plans are discussed with an air of inevitability. Futures are imagined without excessive hesitation, and even uncertainty seems to sit within clear boundaries, framed as a temporary stage rather than a permanent condition. For someone who feels left behind, this difference in tone becomes noticeable long before it becomes painful. At first, it is simply observed, registered quietly without interpretation, because there is no immediate reason to turn it inward. But over time, the repetition of these observations begins to form a contrast that is difficult to overlook, especially when one's own inner experience does not reflect the same sense of progression. The comparison does not come from wanting the same outcomes, nor from believing that there is only one correct way to live, but from sensing that something essential, something structural, seems to be missing. It is the difference between moving forward with uncertainty and standing still with it, between carrying doubt while still advancing and carrying doubt that feels immobilizing. Social spaces subtly change for people who feel left behind, even when no one explicitly excludes them. Conversations shift in content and emphasis, drifting toward topics that assume certain experiences, responsibilities, or commitments. And while participation remains possible, it begins to feel slightly performative, as though one is speaking from the outside rather than from within the same shared reality. Questions that were once casual start to carry weight, not because they are invasive, but because they reveal assumptions about progress that feel increasingly misaligned. What are you working toward? What comes next for you? How is everything going? All of these questions remain simple on the surface, yet they begin to land differently, highlighting the absence of clear answers rather than inviting reflection. In these moments, people who feel left behind often become acutely aware of their own internal hesitation. Not the kind of hesitation that comes from fear alone, but the kind that arises when direction itself feels unclear, when the path forward does not feel obvious enough to commit to, yet remaining where one is no longer feels neutral. This tension creates a peculiar form of self-consciousness. It is not loud or dramatic, but persistent, shaping how one listens, how one responds, and how much of oneself feels safe to reveal. There is a tendency to simplify explanations, to downplay uncertainty, to present life as more coherent than it feels internally, not out of deception, but out of exhaustion, because articulating the truth requires energy that is not always available. Over time, observation turns inward. The attention once directed outward toward others' movement begins to reflect back, illuminating areas of one's own life that feel unfinished, unresolved, or suspended in waiting. This inward turn is rarely gentle. It brings with it questions that have been deferred for too long, questions about choice, agency, and responsibility. Questions that do not have immediate answers, but insist on being acknowledged. Why does movement feel so difficult, even when desire exists? Why do decisions feel heavier, more consequential, more paralyzing than they seem to be for others? Why does time feel abundant one moment and suffocating the next? These questions do not always arise consciously, but they shape emotional tone nonetheless, creating an undercurrent of restlessness that is difficult to soothe. People who feel left behind often describe a sense of being surrounded by motion while remaining still, not physically, but psychologically. Life appears busy, full, and occupied, yet beneath the activity, there is a sense of pause, as though something essential has been placed on hold without a clear timeline for resumption. This pause is not chosen in the traditional sense. It emerges gradually, formed by hesitation, doubt, and the accumulation of unresolved decisions, until it becomes the default state rather than a temporary interval. Watching others move forward under these conditions can create a peculiar emotional mixture. There is admiration without closeness, connection without resonance, participation without belonging. One can be present, supportive, and genuinely happy for others, while simultaneously feeling disconnected from the same narrative of progression. This is where the feeling of being left behind deepens. Not because others are moving, but because one's own movement feels stalled in ways that are difficult to articulate and even harder to resolve. The comparison becomes less about specific achievements and more about tempo. It is the awareness that life seems to have a rhythm, and that one's own internal rhythm no longer matches the surrounding pace. Days may be filled, schedules may be busy, yet the sense of forward motion remains elusive, replaced by a feeling of repetition rather than evolution. This discrepancy in tempo affects perception in subtle ways. Moments of joy feel shorter, moments of doubt feel longer, and the future begins to appear as something abstract rather than imminent. Plans are imagined cautiously, if at all, framed with conditions and contingencies, while others speak about theirs with a confidence that feels foreign rather than intimidating. For many people who feel left behind, there is also a growing awareness of self-observation. They begin to watch themselves watching others, noticing the emotional responses that arise, the tightening in the chest, the quiet withdrawal, the impulse to disengage before comparison becomes too sharp. This self-awareness can be both protective and isolating. Protective because it allows one to manage emotional exposure, to step back when necessary to preserve inner stability. Isolating because it creates distance, reinforcing the sense of being slightly out of step with the world, present but not fully synchronized. Over time, watching others move forward becomes less about envy or inadequacy, and more about questioning one's own capacity for movement. The issue is no longer what others are doing, but why movement feels inaccessible internally, why momentum does not build naturally, and why each step forward seems to require deliberate effort rather than emerging organically. This is where the experience becomes deeply personal. It is no longer a social comparison, but an internal reckoning with uncertainty, identity, and the weight of unrealized potential. People who feel left behind are not unaware of possibility. On the contrary, they often see too many possibilities at once, each carrying implications that feel too heavy to choose lightly. This abundance of imagined futures, rather than liberating, can become paralyzing, especially when paired with the pressure of time and the observation of others who appear to have already chosen. Watching others move, then, becomes a mirror rather than a measurement. It reflects the growing distance between intention and action, between awareness and commitment, between the desire for change and the fear of irreversible choice. And within that reflection, the feeling of being left behind quietly settles deeper, not as a judgment, but as a state of being, waiting for something to shift without yet knowing what that shift might require. For those who feel left behind, time does not simply pass. It presses, not always with urgency, but with a steady presence that becomes increasingly difficult to ignore, especially as years accumulate without the internal sense of movement that was once assumed would naturally accompany them. Time begins to feel less like a neutral backdrop and more like an active force, shaping perception, influencing emotion, and quietly redefining how life is evaluated, not through dramatic deadlines, but through subtle shifts in awareness. The present moment remains familiar enough, filled with tasks, responsibilities, and distractions that keep life functioning. Yet the future begins to feel strangely abstract, no longer something that unfolds gradually, but something that looms, undefined and increasingly loaded with expectation. For many people, this shift happens without warning. One day, time feels expansive, open, forgiving, and the next, it carries a quiet density, as though each passing year now contains implications that cannot be easily set aside. Ages begin to feel symbolic rather than descriptive. They no longer simply indicate how long one has lived, but how much is assumed to have been accomplished, how many paths are thought to be narrowing, and how much uncertainty feels acceptable. This is not necessarily imposed from the outside. Often it arises internally, shaped by observation, cultural narratives, and the gradual internalization of timelines that were never consciously chosen, yet now exert influence nonetheless. People who feel left behind often notice that time affects them differently than it seems to affect others. Not because others are immune to pressure, but because they appear to experience time as something that carries them forward, rather than something they must constantly negotiate. They speak about the future with a sense of continuity, referencing plans, transitions, and next steps as if they are already in motion. While for those who feel left behind, the future feels less like a continuation and more like an unresolved question. This difference in perception creates tension. The present moment becomes charged with evaluation, not just lived as it is, but constantly measured against where one believes they should be by now. Moments that might otherwise feel ordinary begin to carry weight, not because of what they are, but because of what they seem to represent in the larger narrative of progress. Waiting, in this context, takes on a different meaning. It no longer feels like a temporary pause before movement resumes, but like a state that has extended longer than expected, longer than planned, without a clear indication of when or how it will end. This prolonged waiting can distort the experience of time itself. Days may feel repetitive, blending together, while years feel alarmingly distinct, each one marking another cycle completed without the anticipated sense of advancement. People begin to remember time not by events, but by absence, by what did not happen, by decisions that were postponed, by changes that were imagined but never fully realized. This accumulation of unmarked time can create a sense of quiet urgency, not always expressed as panic, but as a persistent internal pressure that influences reminding oneself that time is moving regardless of readiness. The weight of time also affects how people interpret their own past. Choices that once felt reasonable begin to be revisited with increasing scrutiny, not necessarily with regret, but with curiosity tinged by doubt. What if a different decision had been made? What if hesitation had been replaced by action? What if fear had not been mistaken for caution? These questions rarely lead to clarity. Instead, they often deepen the sense of being suspended between what has already passed and what has not yet begun. For people who feel left behind, the past can feel uncomfortably close. Not because it was better, but because it contains moments where the future still felt open, before timelines hardened and expectations crystallized. This closeness can create a longing, not to return, but to recover the sense of possibility that once felt effortless. Time, under these conditions, becomes uneven. Certain moments stretch out, heavy with awareness, while others disappear quickly, leaving behind little impression. This unevenness makes it difficult to feel oriented. Without a clear sense of progression, it becomes challenging to locate oneself within the larger arc of life, to feel anchored in a narrative that makes sense. People who feel left behind often struggle with the idea of beginning again, not because they lack imagination or courage, but because starting anew now feels different than it once did. It carries more perceived risk, more consequence, more awareness of limitation. The same actions that once felt exploratory now feel definitive, as though each choice must justify the time already spent waiting. This perception can create paralysis. The fear is not of failure alone, but of choosing something that later proves to be another pause rather than true movement. As a result, time continues to pass while decisions remain unresolved, reinforcing the very condition that feels most uncomfortable. There is also a quiet grief that can accompany this experience. Not grief for something tangible that was lost, but for versions of life that were imagined, anticipated, or quietly assumed would come into being. These imagined futures are rarely mourned openly, because they were never fully real, yet their absence is deeply felt. People who feel left behind may struggle to articulate this grief, because it does not fit traditional narratives of loss. There is no clear ending, no definitive moment where something was taken away. Instead, there is a slow realization that certain possibilities feel further away now, not impossible, but more difficult to access. This realization does not always lead to despair. Often, it leads to heightened awareness. Time becomes something to be watched carefully, knowing it is finite but uncertain, heavy with implication, but resistant to control. For some, this awareness eventually becomes a catalyst for change. For others, it deepens the sense of caution. But in this chapter of the experience, the weight of time is not yet resolved. It is simply present. It sits alongside daily life, influencing mood, shaping thought, and quietly reminding those who feel left behind that time continues forward, regardless of whether inner movement has caught up. This awareness does not demand immediate action. It does not provide clear answers. It simply marks a shift in perception, a point where time can no longer be treated as neutral and must instead be reckoned with, even if that reckoning remains unfinished. For people who feel left behind, the most unsettling part of the experience is often not the absence of visible progress, but the emergence of an inner stillness that does not feel chosen, welcomed, or even fully understood. yet slowly becomes the dominant emotional backdrop against which daily life unfolds. This inner pause does not resemble rest or recovery because it carries no sense of renewal, clarity, or intentional withdrawal, and instead feels like a suspension that developed gradually, shaped by accumulated hesitation, unresolved questions, and the quiet pressure of time continuing forward without offering a clear direction to follow. From the outside, there may be little indication that anything has changed, since responsibilities are still met, routines remain intact, and life continues to function in a way that appears stable and orderly. Yet, beneath that surface stability, there is a growing awareness that momentum has weakened, not in a dramatic or catastrophic way, but enough to disrupt the sense of continuity that once made life feel internally coherent. Within this pause, motivation becomes fragmented rather than absent, appearing briefly in moments of inspiration or curiosity before dissolving again into uncertainty, leaving behind ideas that feel unfinished and intentions that never fully translate into action, not because of laziness or lack of capacity, but because direction itself feels unstable. People who feel left behind often struggle to understand why clarity seems so difficult to reach, especially when they possess self-awareness, intelligence, and a genuine desire to move forward, which makes the stillness feel less like a limitation and more like a contradiction that resists simple explanation. The pause is reinforced by heightened awareness, because once the absence of movement is noticed, every potential step forward becomes subject to evaluation, comparison, and anticipation, as though each decision must compensate for lost time, justify previous hesitation, and guarantee future alignment, creating a level of pressure that quietly discourages action before it even begins. As a result, the mind becomes increasingly active while the body remains still, caught in a loop of reflection, projection, and rehearsal, where outcomes are imagined repeatedly and consequences are weighed carefully. Yet no option feels sufficiently grounded to commit to without reservation. This imbalance between mental motion and physical stillness deepens the sensation of suspension, creating a state where effort is expended internally while external movement remains limited, reinforcing the belief that something essential is missing or inaccessible. The inner pause also reshapes emotional experience in subtle ways, softening intensity without eliminating feeling, so that joy is felt but quickly contained. Anxiety arises without a clear object, and sadness lingers without demanding expression, creating an emotional landscape that feels muted rather than empty. In relationships, this internal stillness often manifests as restraint rather than withdrawal, where presence is maintained, but personal uncertainty is carefully contained, not out of dishonesty, but out of the exhaustion that comes from trying to articulate an experience that feels unresolved even to oneself. People who feel left behind may find themselves listening more than speaking, supporting others while withholding their own confusion, and engaging socially while feeling internally distant, which gradually reinforces a sense of separation that exists despite continued connection. Over time, this pause begins to affect self-perception, shifting identity away from action and toward observation. Not as a deliberate choice, but as a consequence of extended hesitation, causing individuals to see themselves as thinkers, analysts, or witnesses to life, rather than active participants within it. This shift can feel deeply unsettling, particularly for those who once associated personal worth with growth, movement, and visible progression, because the absence of those markers leaves identity feeling unanchored and provisional. Yet within the pause, awareness continues to sharpen, allowing for a deeper perception of nuance, contradiction, and emotional complexity, as the stillness creates space to notice patterns in oneself and others that might otherwise remain unseen during periods of rapid movement. This heightened sensitivity, while often enriching, can further complicate action because it makes simplistic decisions feel insufficient and definitive commitments feel prematurely restrictive, reinforcing the belief that waiting is preferable to choosing incorrectly. At the core of the inner pause lies a quiet fear, not necessarily of failure, but of movement that does not resolve the deeper sense of misalignment, of effort that leads only to a different form of stagnation, and of choice that closes possibilities rather than opening them. As a result, stillness begins to feel safer than action, even as it becomes increasingly heavy, creating a paradox in which the desire to move forward exists alongside a persistent reluctance to begin. This pause does not announce itself as temporary, nor does it offer guidance about how to exit it, and so it is endured rather than resolved, becoming an accepted condition that quietly shapes perception, emotion, and imagination, while the question of movement remains present but unanswered. For people who feel left behind, comparison does not usually arrive as a loud or deliberate act, nor does it resemble the obvious envy or resentment that is often assumed to accompany it, because it develops quietly through observation, settling into awareness without demanding attention. It emerges while watching others live their lives in ways that appear natural and continuous, not necessarily impressive or extraordinary, but coherent, as though each step connects smoothly to the next without requiring constant recalibration. This comparison is rarely about wanting the same outcomes or achievements, because the issue is not desire for a particular life, but the growing recognition that others seem to occupy a different relationship with progress itself. They move through time with a sense of sequence, speaking about past, present, and future as parts of the same unfolding narrative, while those who feel left behind often experience these dimensions as fragmented, disconnected, or misaligned. The quiet nature of this comparison makes it difficult to identify and even harder to discuss, because it does not feel hostile or competitive, and there is often genuine happiness for others woven into the experience, creating an emotional complexity that resists simple interpretation. People who feel left behind may find themselves measuring their lives not against dramatic successes, but against ordinary continuity, noticing how others transition from one phase to another with an ease that feels increasingly unfamiliar. Conversations become moments of silent contrast, where descriptions of work, relationships, or future plans reveal an underlying assumption of forward motion that does not resonate internally. The listener remains engaged, responds appropriately, and often offers support or encouragement. Yet internally, there is a growing awareness that their own narrative lacks the same sense of flow. This awareness does not immediately produce distress. At first, it manifests as curiosity, as a quiet noticing of difference, but over time, repetition gives it weight, transforming observation into evaluation and difference into distance. The comparison deepens as people begin to notice how others relate to uncertainty. For those who feel left behind, uncertainty often feels immobilizing, something that must be resolved before action can occur, while for others, uncertainty appears to coexist comfortably with movement, accepted as a natural companion rather than a barrier. This difference can be difficult to reconcile. It raises questions about internal capacity, resilience, and courage, not in an accusatory way, but in a reflective one, as individuals wonder why they experience hesitation more intensely, why doubt feels heavier, and why commitment feels more demanding. The quiet comparison also affects how people perceive themselves over time. Each instance of observation adds another layer to the internal narrative, subtly shaping self-image and expectation, until identity becomes partially defined by what has not yet happened rather than by what has. This process is rarely conscious. It unfolds gradually, influenced by repeated exposure to others' progress and the absence of corresponding movement internally. People who feel left behind often attempt to neutralize this comparison through rational thought, reminding themselves that life is not linear, that timelines are arbitrary, and that progress cannot be universally measured. While these reminders may be intellectually convincing, they often fail to fully dissolve the emotional impact because the comparison operates at a level deeper than logic. It is not about beliefs, but about felt experience, about the sense of alignment or misalignment with the flow of life. As the comparison continues, it begins to influence emotional tone. Moments of inspiration may be followed by sudden doubt, and periods of motivation may dissolve quickly when contrasted with others' apparent stability or momentum. This fluctuation can be exhausting, creating a cycle of brief hope and recurring hesitation that reinforces the feeling of being left behind. There is also a growing awareness of visibility. People who feel left behind may begin to sense that their inner experience is not easily seen or understood by others, because it does not manifest in obvious struggle or dramatic change. From the outside, life appears functional, even calm, which can make the internal comparison feel isolating, as though one is silently measuring against standards that no one else seems to notice or question. This invisibility can intensify the comparison, because it removes opportunities for external validation or reassurance. Without shared language or acknowledgement, the experience remains internal, reinforcing the sense that one is navigating a private difficulty while others move forward with shared understanding and recognition. The quiet comparison also reshapes anticipation. Future events are approached with caution rather than excitement, because they are already weighed against perceived expectations and imagined outcomes. Rather than serving as points of possibility, they become markers of evaluation, moments where progress will again be measured, implicitly or explicitly. This anticipation can dampen motivation, as the emotional cost of comparison begins to outweigh the potential satisfaction of movement. People may avoid situations that highlight contrast, not out of avoidance of others, but out of a need to protect internal equilibrium. This withdrawal is often subtle, expressed through reduced engagement rather than explicit absence, and it further reinforces the sense of being slightly removed from the shared rhythm of life. Yet the quiet comparison is not entirely destructive. It carries within it a heightened awareness of internal values, of what feels meaningful versus what feels performative, of which forms of progress resonate and which do not. People who feel left behind often develop a deep sensitivity to authenticity, becoming attuned to the difference between movement that is internally aligned and movement that is driven primarily by expectation. This sensitivity can complicate action, but it also preserves integrity, preventing premature commitment to paths that feel misaligned even when they appear successful from the outside. The comparison, then, is not simply about others, but about the relationship between inner truth and external motion. It reveals the tension between wanting to move and wanting to move in a way that feels honest, between the desire for belonging and the need for coherence. In this space, the feeling of being left behind persists, not as a judgment of worth, but as a reflection of misaligned rhythm, a quiet signal that the pace of the world and the pace of the self have drifted apart, awaiting a moment when they might, once again, begin to converge. Feeling left behind is rarely about standing still while the world moves on, because most people continue to live, work, think, and care, even while carrying this sense of distance inside them. It is about rhythm rather than position, about the experience of time, movement, and direction no longer aligning in the way they once did, creating a quiet tension that does not demand immediate resolution but refuses to disappear. For many, this feeling remains unspoken, not because it lacks depth, but because it does not fit neatly into familiar stories of success or failure, making it easier to carry privately than to explain. And perhaps what matters most is not whether this feeling is resolved quickly, but whether it is allowed to be acknowledged without judgment as part of the inner experience of moving through life at a pace that feels uncertain, uneven, and deeply human.